There's no fishing rods on those boats. They move fast. When you see a boat with 4 engines or 5 engines on, going 40, 50 miles an hour, well, they get hit. We save 25,000 lives every single time we knock out a boat, and it's over 96% stopped by sea. We're trying to figure out who the other 4% are, frankly. And we're going to have the same success, but even quicker, because it's much easier on land. If they want to come by land, they're going to end up having a big problem. They're going to get blown to pieces, because we don't want our people poisoned. 300,000 people died, probably last year 300,000. A lot of people say it was 200. Somebody said last night, it was only 175,000 people. That's like...
You just watched the 21st century equivalent of Heinrich Himmler, describing his plans for pacification in explicit terms that should curdle the blood of anyone who understands the architecture of violence and the grammar of tyranny. Trump boasted that each boat destroyed saves 25,000 American lives, a numerical assertion so preposterous it would require drugs on 5 boats to be responsible for 125,000 deaths, nearly double the actual number of overdose deaths in 1 year, that we're watching someone conjure death tolls from whole cloth to justify extrajudicial killings on the high seas, and when he pivots to threatening land operations where people will get blown to pieces, understand that this constitutes military action that has already killed at least 11 people on the first strike and is being discussed for expansion into continental warfare. This rhetoric of blowing human beings to pieces because they're allegedly carrying substances across borders deserves examination through the cold lens of history and international law before we even touch the moral catastrophe it represents. Legal experts have argued that the military action targeting suspected drug smuggling boats was already legally dubious because the president lacked authority to carry them out. The Washington Post reported that the first boat was struck twice, killing survivors, prompting concerns the follow-up strike may have constituted a war crime, since combatants who are wounded, sick, or shipwrecked no longer pose a threat and should not be attacked. We're discussing actual war crimes here, not metaphorical ones, not hyperbolic ones, but actions that legal scholars are examining under the Geneva Conventions while Trump brags about the body count and promises more carnage. The mathematics of his lies deserve immediate deconstruction because authoritarianism always begins with the systematic corruption of empirical reality. Trump claimed 300,000 people died from drug overdoses when actual CDC data showed about 80,000 deaths in 2024, representing a 25% decline from the previous year. Provisional data shows about 87,000 drug overdose deaths from October 2023 to September 2024, down from around 114,000 the previous year, the fewest in any 12-month period since June 2020. The overdose crisis is declining without his boat strikes, declining because of widespread distribution of naloxone, better access to treatment for substance use disorders, and shifts in the illegal drug supply. Yet here stands a man manufacturing casualty figures, 3 times higher than reality, to justify what amounts to a naval blockade enforced through summary execution. What makes this moment so historically ominous is that at least 61 people have been killed in 14 U.S. military strikes on boats in the Caribbean Sea and Pacific Ocean since early September. The United States has conducted more than 24 strikes against alleged drug boats, killing over 100 people in the Pacific and Caribbean since September, according to the Pentagon. These aren't hypothetical threats or campaign bluster anymore. These are actual corpses floating in international waters, and the infrastructure of mechanized killing has been activated under the flimsiest of legal pretexts while U.S. officials have not provided specific evidence that the vessels were smuggling drugs or posed a threat to the U.S. MDAO. The Venezuela focus represents something even more sinister than drug war escalation, because the impressive U.S. military deployment may be part of an intimidation campaign to provoke panic within the regime, with the claim that the objective is fighting drugs not being credible given the magnitude of military buildup. This is regime change dressed in counter-narcotics camouflage, the same formula that turned Colombia into a graveyard and Mexico into a charnel house, now being applied to Venezuela, with explicit threats that people will be blown to pieces on land if they approach borders with substances. The United States has decided merit summary execution without trial, or evidence, or any pretense of due process. Let's talk about what blown to pieces actually means in practice, because the sanitized language of military strikes obscures the visceral reality of what happens to human bodies when they're targeted by weapons systems designed for maximum destructive efficiency. Trump posted footage of attacks showing missiles striking boats and setting them on fire, and these aren't precision operations designed to capture and prosecute. These are kill missions that, occurred even when boats appeared to be turning around, with individuals on board seeing military aircraft overhead and attempting to turn back before the U.S. hit the boat. We're witnessing extrajudicial executions being celebrated and expanded, with the victims described as narco-terrorists, despite the Trump administration providing no publicized evidence for allegations that vessels were operated by designated groups. The designation of cartels as terrorist organizations represents a deliberate legal maneuver to bypass constitutional constraints on military force, but experts note that designating drug cartels as terrorist organizations doesn't give the administration authority to use military force in this way, and there's nothing magic about calling something a terrorist organization that gives the president authority to respond militarily. This is lawfare in its most authoritarian manifestation, the strategic deployment of legal language to create permission structures for violence that would otherwise be understood as criminal acts, and Trump's promise that land operations will result in people getting blown to pieces represents the logical extension of a framework that treats human beings as legitimate military targets based solely on their proximity to prohibited substances. The failed war on drugs provides the historical context that makes this moment so tragically foreseeable and yet so urgently requiring resistance. For 50 years since Nixon declared drugs public enemy number one, the U.S.-led war on drugs has escalated dramatically, witnessing vast growth in illegal drug markets, while enormously amplifying the dangers of drug use, exacerbating damage associated with drug markets, and fueling organized crime and corruption with an incalculable toll of bloodshed and suffering worldwide. Latin America has borne the catastrophic brunt of prohibitionist enforcement, where concentration of drug trafficking has resulted in the world's highest crime rates, with murder reaching 32.6 per 100,000 population in 2008. The pattern repeats across every theater of the drug war, where enforcement and interdiction have been intensified. Supply adjusts through new routes and new producers, while global cocaine production and consumption are at record highs, with the UN reporting output rising roughly a third in 2023 to over 3,700 tons, and an estimated 25 million people using cocaine, as the supply chain has diversified and demand has scarcely flinched. What Trump is threatening represents the literal weaponization of a policy framework that has demonstrably failed to reduce drug availability while succeeding spectacularly at generating corpses, and his specific threat to blow people to pieces on land marks a threshold crossing from naval interdiction into what would effectively constitute warfare against civilian populations in border regions. Trump has turned a 60-foot wide strip of federal land spanning 3 states on the southern border into a military installation, with the apparent plan to let the military act as a de facto border police force apprehending, searching, and detaining people who cross unlawfully, creating the infrastructure for the land-based violence he's now threatening to implement. The Posse Comitatus Act exists precisely to prevent what Trump is engineering, yet Trump's memo appears designed to sidestep the act, which normally bars federal armed forces from conducting domestic law enforcement, and federal troops are trained to fight and destroy an enemy, not for domestic law enforcement, creating risks to migrants, U.S. citizens who may inadvertently trespass, and the soldiers themselves. The distinction between law enforcement and military operations matters immensely in democracies that claim to value human rights, because law enforcement operates under constitutional constraints designed to protect due process, while military operations operate under rules of engagement that authorize lethal force against combatants, and Trump's promise that land crossers will be blown to pieces indicates he's deliberately collapsing this distinction to unleash military violence against civilians. The racist architecture of this violence demands explicit naming, because the drug war has always functioned as a mechanism for controlling and destroying racialized populations, and Trump's specific focus on Venezuelan boats while promising to blow apart people crossing southern land borders reveals the white supremacist logic animating his enforcement vision. Trump's proclamation classifying border crossing by undocumented migrants from Mexico as an invasion enshrines racist tropes of migrants as carriers of disease and threats to public safety and national security in law, providing the ideological justification for violence that targets brown and black bodies specifically, while leaving untouched the pharmaceutical companies whose opioid distributions killed hundreds of thousands, or the financial systems that launder cartel profits. When he says we don't want our people poisoned, while threatening to blow human beings to pieces, recognize that this framing positions certain bodies as inherently poisonous, as substances to be eliminated rather than persons with rights. And this rhetorical move performs the dehumanization necessary for mass violence to become politically acceptable. Trump told supporters that getting migrants out will be a bloody story, making explicit what most politicians keep implicit, that the enforcement vision he's articulating requires blood, and he's not only willing to spill it, but eager to broadcast his willingness as a show of strength to his base. The numbers he cites about fentanyl deaths deserve scrutiny, because they're being weaponized to justify killing that has nothing to do with reducing overdoses and everything to do with demonstrating dominance through spectacular violence. In 2023, fentanyl was responsible for about 199 deaths every day, and over 250,000 Americans have died from fentanyl overdoses since 2021, representing a genuine public health catastrophe. But drug experts say Venezuela plays a minor role in trafficking drugs that reach the U.S., meaning these boat strikes are theater rather than intervention, spectacle designed to satisfy authoritarian appetites for visible domination rather than evidence-based policy designed to reduce harm. The actual solutions to overdose deaths exist, and we know what they are because multiple factors contribute to the drop in overdose deaths, including widespread distribution of naloxone, better access to evidence-based treatment for substance use disorders, shifts in the illegal drug supply, and continued investments in prevention and response programs. Treatment works, harm reduction works, naloxone distribution works, yet Trump proposes accelerating the exact militarized enforcement that every study shows fails to reduce drug availability while succeeding at destabilizing entire regions and generating massive casualties among the populations least responsible for the crisis. The broader militarization of the border that makes his threat credible represents a decades-long bipartisan project that Trump is now weaponizing to its logical authoritarian conclusion, because creation of DHS after 9/11 accelerated government operations on the U.S.-Mexico border with CBP growing dramatically, despite shocking patterns of serious misconduct, including child abuse, sexual assault, and murder, with Border Patrol agents more than doubling between 2000 and 2011. Democrats built this infrastructure, and Republicans are now deploying it for explicit violence, which should radicalize everyone's understanding of how liberalism's technocratic management of borders creates the conditions for fascistic escalation. The promise that enforcement will be even quicker on land than at sea signals that he understands exactly what he's proposing, that boats can turn around and attempt escape while people on foot at borders cannot evade military targeting with the same ease, meaning land operations will produce higher body counts with less ambiguity about the nature of the killings. Rubio said some boats need to get blown up and we can't live in a world where they do a U-turn and so we can't touch them anymore, articulating a doctrine that once you're designated for death, attempting to flee doesn't restore your right to life, and applying this logic to land borders means anyone approaching with substances becomes a legitimate target for military weapons regardless of whether they surrender or retreat. The invocation of saving lives through killing deserves recognition as a fascist formulation that recurs throughout histories of genocide and mass violence, where perpetrators position themselves as defenders of the body politic against polluting elements that must be eliminated for the collective health of the pure population. Trump said every boat destroyed is an act of kindness, casting extrajudicial execution as compassion. And this is precisely how atrocity becomes normalized, through narrative frames that invert moral categories until killing becomes caring and violence becomes protection. We need to be absolutely clear about what land-based blowing to pieces would entail operationally, because the infrastructure already exists, and the precedents are being established in real time. Trump's memorandum blends traditional law enforcement rationales with traditional military use of force rationales in ways that obscure the fine-grained limits that ought to regulate lethal force, with concerning implications for the extent to which lethal force would be permitted against unauthorized aliens identified just inside the U.S. side of the southern border. The designation of borderlands as military installations creates the legal architecture for treating border crossers as enemy combatants, subject to rules of engagement that authorize deadly force, and Trump's promise they'll be blown to pieces indicates he fully intends to operationalize this framework. The silence from mainstream political institutions about these threats and these actual killings already happening at sea reveals how normalized militarized border violence has become, how thoroughly the national security state has captured both parties' imagination, such that extrajudicial killings in international waters barely register as scandalous. Senator Jack Reed condemned the strikes as an outrageous violation of law, but where is the impeachment inquiry? Where are the criminal referrals? Where is the international human rights campaign that should be mobilizing against a government that's conducting what may violate Geneva Conventions prohibiting targeting of civilians or defenseless armed forces members and requiring the wounded to be collected and cared for? The Venezuelan government's resistance to these strikes and Trump's escalating threats demonstrate how imperialism and drug war enforcement have always been inseparable projects, where the U.S. has a long history of intervention in Latin America, with the war on drugs being a convenient extension of almost 200-year-old policy, pursuing commercial and political objectives, explaining why failing drug policy persisted despite overwhelming failure to decrease production or trafficking. The drugs provide the excuse, the violence provides the means. The actual objective is maintaining hemispheric dominance and punishing governments that refuse subordination to U.S. interests, and the bodies of people allegedly carrying prohibited substances become the raw material for demonstrating power. Trump's claim that he stopped 96% of drugs by sea should be examined with extreme skepticism, because interdiction has never meaningfully reduced drug availability. Seizures simply push trafficking to new routes, while every crackdown redraws routes, and every new plan creates fresh gray markets with promises of decisive blows arriving like weather, loud and seasonal, and rarely life-changing for neighborhoods. The balloon effect describes how enforcement pressure in one location causes trafficking to expand elsewhere, documented across decades of drug war escalation. Yet Trump promises the same failed strategy implemented with more spectacular violence, and expects different results, which is the definition of policy insanity, except that reducing drug flows was never the actual point. The actual point is the demonstration of sovereign power through the production of death, the performance of state capacity to designate certain populations as killable and then kill them with impunity, and Trump's promise that land operations will involve people getting blown to pieces represents the rhetorical preparation of the population to accept mass violence at borders as normal and necessary. This is how atrocity gets normalized, through the gradual escalation of violence accompanied by rhetoric that frames victims as threats and killing as security, until the previously unthinkable becomes policy, and the policy becomes so routine it stops generating outrage. What makes this moment so dangerous is that the overdose crisis is actually declining through public health interventions while Trump is ramping up enforcement theater, meaning deaths have dropped to the fewest in any 12-month period since June 2020, yet overdose remains the leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 44, requiring sustained public health investment, not military escalation. The boat strikes and border militarization aren't addressing the overdose crisis. They're exploiting it to justify violence that serves entirely different political purposes related to authoritarian display and white supremacist border control. The movement work required in this moment demands both immediate emergency response to prevent the land-based violence he's threatening, and longer-term structural transformation of how we understand drug policy and border enforcement. Immediate organizing must focus on documenting these killings, providing legal defense and sanctuary for migrants facing militarized enforcement, and building international pressure through human rights frameworks to constrain U.S. military action. We need lawyers filing war crimes complaints, journalists investigating every strike and every casualty, activists disrupting the military infrastructure being deployed for border enforcement, and movements building solidarity between U.S. communities devastated by the overdose crisis and Latin American communities devastated by drug war violence. The long-term transformation requires rejecting the entire prohibitionist framework that makes this violence possible, because you cannot have militarized drug enforcement without producing mass death, and you cannot have borders enforced through violence without creating the conditions for fascism. Decriminalization and harm reduction represent the only evidence-based approaches to reducing drug deaths. Legalization and regulation represent the only approaches to eliminating black markets that fuel cartels, and freedom of movement represents the only ethical approach to migration that doesn't require treating human beings as invasive species to be repelled through force. Trump's promise that people will get blown to pieces if they come by land should haunt everyone who hears it, because this is a promise he has the capacity to keep. The infrastructure exists, and the precedents are being established, and the dehumanizing rhetoric has already been deployed to make such violence politically palatable to his base. The militarized approach leads to avoidable tragedies, with 97 people having died following lethal encounters with CBP personnel since 2003, including shootings, car chases, and agents forcing a young man to drink liquid methamphetamine, and scaling this violence up through explicit policies of blowing people to pieces will produce a body count that should be understood as state-sanctioned murder. The silence is complicity, and the normalization is the point, and every moment we allow this violence to be discussed as policy, rather than prosecuted as crime, we participate in the creation of conditions under which mass atrocity becomes bureaucratic routine. This is the moment to refuse the nationalist framings that position some lives as grievable and others as disposable, to reject the security logics that treat borders as sites requiring military defense, and to build movements capable of defending human dignity against the forces of organized state violence that Trump is mobilizing with such explicit enthusiasm. His promise that they'll get blown to pieces isn't a warning, it's a threat, and it demands a response that matches the urgency of what's being threatened, because history shows us exactly where this rhetoric leads when it's allowed to become operational reality.